Hello, friends. Hi Werewolf, show us your magic sword. Be sure to subscribe to my channel. Okay, I am not imagining things here. I caught a glimpse of two red eyes staring into my bedroom window last night. I blinked and they were gone. I was pretty shaken and had to leave my house. I bolted for my car and stayed the night at a friend's house. I'm home now, but I need to secure my windows or something. Here goes more transcribing. Local legends are rife anywhere you go in the world. I can't say which ones are made up and which ones are real, but I can say that we had a living local legend. I say had because it ran into me and Lenny. An old Dean legend tells of the Kainos, a monster. Kainos stands for big fish in Dean. Legend has it that a young brave regularly paddled his boat around the perimeter of Cold Lake to visit a beautiful young girl who he hoped would one day be his wife. Cold Lake is big, and winds can whip up large waves that could easily swamp a small birch bark canoe. One evening the lake was particularly calm, the water like glass, so the brave took a shortcut across French Bay. It's a small bay attached to Cold Lake. As the brave neared the middle of the bay, there was a thundering splash as the Kainos roared up and bit the boat in half. The brave desperately tried to beat off the Kainos with his paddle, but soon disappeared below the waves. The young girl had been waiting on the opposite bank and witnessed the altercation. She waited in vain until the morning for her lover. All that was found was small pieces of boat and a broken up paddle. It makes for a good story. Most people just assume this was a scary story told to stop people from crossing open bodies of water, which is dangerous in a small craft like a canoe. Nowadays lots of folks use French Bay as a swimming hole, fishing ground, campsite. It is really popular. It is surrounded by trees on all sides and very much picturesque. One particular summer a family was filming a moose swim across the bay. You could hear them gasp on the film as the moose just disappeared beneath the water, never to come back up. Animals being eaten is one thing. I get called in when people are in danger. The Kainos made itself our target when a man was swimming around a point in the bay quite a distance from the shore when his family witnessed him go under, never to resurface. Police searched the bay and surrounding area, but he was never found. That is when my envelope showed up. I can stand my ground when I'm, well, on the ground. Fighting something in the water? That made me a little uncomfortable, and when you're uncomfortable with a job, it's a sure sign you need some backup. I called up Lenny and we met out front of Tommy's place. After our customary exchange, we made our way inside to see what Tommy could do to help us out. He had to give his chin a scratch for a moment before offering a few tools and suggestions on how to handle this cryptid. We ended up leaving with harpoon guns, 2 sets of air tanks, and a handgun each that was specifically designed for underwater firing. I honestly had never heard of a weapon like this before going to see Tommy, but I guess that is why he has the job he does. The handgun is similar to a regular firearm, except it fires flechette rounds and the barrel isn't rifled. We stopped off at the local Walmart and picked up some cheap fishing gear. Lenny had already loaded a small aluminium boat he owned into the back of his truck, and we made our way to the bay. Lenny stopped his truck just after the turnoff and I pulled up next to him. He told me to vacate the area, give the people a spiel about fish and wildlife, doing testing in the area. I sent home one camper, a guy fishing off the dock, and a family playing in the shallows. After they had all departed, Lenny set up a roadblock at the entrance to the bay with a warning about a dangerous animal in the area. Usually that was enough to keep folks away. We donned our diving tanks and strapped on our sidearm, then tossed fishing rods, harpoon guns, a tackle box and a cooler into the boat. Lenny got in first and I pushed us out into the water. We paddled out to the middle of the bay and began to discuss how to lure in a big fish. Lenny grinned and popped open the cooler I had assumed was for show. Inside was a bundle of red meat and viscera wrapped in some kind of netting. Lenny loved to watch Discovery Channel and figured if sharks liked it, maybe this thing would too. He hooked the meat bag onto his rod and let it fall into the water, steadying the rod under a seat of the boat. The meat bag was about 2 feet in diameter, so anything that could fit it into its mouth was likely encrypted. I couldn't argue with his reasoning and opted to go under to have a look while he kept an eye out for civilians braving the barricades and signs, or coming in from the main lake. I had never been diving before, and the idea of getting into the water with a man-eating fish wasn't one I particularly enjoyed, but that was the job description. I slung the harpoon over my shoulder and fell backward off the boat into the water, taking a moment to orient myself. I swam over to where I could see the fishing line enter the water and grabbed it with one hand to trace during my descent. For such a small body of water, I couldn't believe how deep it was. I swam down 20 feet before looking back up to see the outline of the boat framed against the water. It is a surreal environment to be in, and I touched the gun at my hip to stir some confidence in myself. Taking one last look at the darkness that surrounded me, I continued down 30, 40, 50 feet. There was not much light down here. I couldn't see very far in front of me. I had reached the end of the line where the meat bag was hooked and didn't want to let go. It felt like I might be lost forever if I lost that link back to the surface. Enough light made it to the bottom for me to see the ghosts of rocks that made up the bottom dancing in the moving water. I remembered the high-powered light that was attached to the diving harness and flipped it on. I directed my beam, turning my body and scanning my surroundings. There were lots of rocks. A few fish interested in picking at the meat bag darted away when the light touched them. I looked up. I could barely make out the outline of the boat on the surface, and this reassured me a little. I let go of the line and started to explore. One area my light wouldn't penetrate, so I gripped the harpoon gun and moved forward with caution. As I got within maybe 10 feet, it became apparent that the darkness wasn't being penetrated because it was a deep underwater cavern reaching farther than my light could. Shivers drifted up and down my spine thinking about having to explore it in search of this monster. I decided to head back to the surface to reconvene with Lenny. I was not going in there on my own. As I began to turn to head back to the surface, silt and sediment was whipped into a frenzy at the mouth of the cavern and a hulking form shot out from the darkness, likely disturbed by my probing lights. My grip tightened on the harpoon trigger and I took a brief second to aim before letting the spear fly. A large plume of red drifted in the water like smoke and bubbles escaped my mask as a massive tail knocked the gun from my hands and sent me spinning in the water. I tried to orient myself, but before I could move I felt the strap of the harpoon go tight. Tommy had forgotten to mention one very important detail about the harpoon gun, that the spear was affixed to the gun for reeling in fish. As my body was dragged upward, the force of the moving water tore the mask from my face and cold water rushed in. I held my breath as best I could. After but a moment I realized I was in the air, some 10 feet above the water. My confusion was met by the sight of an overturned aluminium boat and Lenny staring up at me from the water with a look of shock on his face. He would later recount how he had been testing the airflow of his mask when his world exploded from beneath him and the boat was tipped over. 15 feet of what looked like a deformed wall. I was in the process of disappearing back into the water with me attached to it by a long steel cable. I barely had enough presence of mind to slam my mask back into my face before I hit the water again. This cryptid was circling the overturned boat like a shark hungry for blood. I faced the oncoming water so it pressed the mask into my face rather than tear it off, and hauled myself hand over hand on the braided steel until I found the side of the Kainos. Lazy red mist still seeped into the surrounding water from the wound. I had hit it on its right side, just past where the gills were located, which was a testament to how fast it moved as I had been aiming for the head. I felt the circle of the creature deviates and I retrieved the handgun from my side as we sped up in the water. I saw gills open on the side of the creature and squeezed off 4 rounds of flechette into the openings, which spewed more red into the water. The creature tugged violently to the left and I almost lost my grip on the braided cable. We were still near the surface and I saw a harpoon go speeding past my body, just inches from where I had been a moment before. Lenny was floating 5 feet below the waterline and had been aiming for the cryptid's head as it had aimed for him. When my flechette burned into the gills, I had sent it off track and Lenny's shot had missed, almost hitting me. I cursed in my head and waited for the gills to open again, squeezing off every round of flechette I had into the openings once more. The mist of red turned into a sheet as the wounds wept blood into the violently churning water and I released the weapon. I had no harpoon and no handgun. Our boat was a wreck and Lenny was bait. I straddled the creature and pulled with all my might at the braided cable, hoping the barbed harpoon was wreaking havoc on the insides of the creature. This had the desired effect and violent spasms rocked the cryptid. It dove down, apparently deciding this fight was not worth the injuries it had sustained. Ice-cold terror shot through me as I realized I was about to go into the thing's underwater cavern with it, helpless and affixed. I gave myself 1 moment to think, to have clarity, and reacted before I even realized what my plan was. I let one hand fall to my leg and unbuttoned the leather sheath where my werewolf tooth dagger was. In one smooth motion, I cut the strap holding the harpoon gun to my body and sunk the blade as deep into the side of the cryptid as I could, and then, I let go of the braided cable. The knife was slightly curved and stayed hooked into the flesh as the drag of the water tore me back. I had to guess I ripped open a good 10 feet of the rubbery flesh before being dislodged and set adrift in the water. Where before there had been a steady sheet of red flowing past me, there was now an explosion of blood as though a volcano had let go from the side of the cryptid. I back-paddled toward the surface as fast as my arms would let me, and the creature let out an outburst before going still in the water. I watched it sink into the darkness as I struggled toward the surface. Lenny met me halfway and I signaled for him to rise, pointing to the surface. We broke the water and tore off the masks. I told him the creature was most definitely dead. He looked visibly relieved and we both grabbed onto the aluminium craft that was overturned in the water, kicking our way back to shore. The boat itself was unsalvageable. The impact from the Kainos had nearly folded it in two. Lenny had hit his head pretty hard off the edge of it and had a good gash to show for our efforts. I was luckily shaken but unharmed. I took the time to patch up the wound and then we both loaded the wreck of a boat into the back of Lenny's truck. Looking over the bay, we could see a growing pool of red thinning out in the water. It didn't seem like any bits of the monster were going to float back to the surface. We both drove out and a group of teams was in the process of moving our barricades to gain entry. Lenny and I got out, retrieving the barricades and letting them know the coast was clear. I could see one of them furtively glancing between the folded up wreck of a boat and the freshly patched wound on the side of Lenny's head. I chuckled to myself as the group of teens loaded back into their vehicle and drove off in a different direction, away from French Bay. This is only one of a few times I've ever had to deal with a water-based cryptid, but it was especially notable because it was one of local legend. Maybe I'll write down some of the other things I've had to deal with, like the Kelpie. That creature is nightmare fuel. For now though, I'm going to get some rest.